Hello and welcome to the IO Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. Debates about the character and stability of an emerging multipolar order have regained urgency in both academic and policy circles. Recently, I read a great article, "The Multipolar World is Nothing New, Why the Return of Many Powers Does Not Mean the Birth of a New Order." This episode explores whether multipolarity represents a return to historical normality and considers its implications for global governments, regional dynamics, and the strategic agency of both great and smaller powers. My guest today is the author of that article, Mark Katz. Welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Mark is a professor emeritus of government and politics at George Mason University Starr School of Policy and Government, where he taught from 1988 until his retirement in 2024, which is 36 years. A specialist in Russian foreign policy, great power competition, and the international politics of the Middle East, his research has long focused on Soviet and Russian engagement with the developing world. And those of us they remember his article, "Gorbachev Ruined My Career," which is still available, and I highly recommend to read it to everyone. And as we can see, Mark's career hasn't been ruined. We can still read his work, books, articles, and even have a talk like today. So let's speak about the multipolar era. And my first question is, you argue that multipolarity is a historical norm. Does it mean that post-World War II liberal international order, with its specific institutional norms, was essentially a 75-year aberration that we mistook for a permanent evolution of human governments?
Well, I would argue that certainly during the Cold War, a liberal international order was not the dominant one. In other words, it was limited to North America, Western Europe, Japan for most of that time. Most of the countries in the developing world, they may have been pro-Western, then of course some became pro-Soviet, and not that many were democratic. Obviously India was democratic, but was certainly not part of the Western liberal order. So it seems to me that the whole notion of a liberal international order really didn't catch fire until the very end of the Cold War. It was during the Gorbachev era and beyond when we saw democratic, change in obviously in Eastern Europe, but also in places like the Philippines, South Korea, Chile. That's when I think there. And then of course there was the famous article, "The End of History" by Frank Fukuyama in 1989. And although everyone criticized it at the time, I think it did reflect a general belief that with the decline of communism, at least Soviet-style communism, that Western democracy was going to sooner or later spread throughout the world. In other words, that was sort of the illusion, and it was more a function of the late Cold War, early post-Cold War era than anything else.
When you had that feeling that a liberal order was not dominant, does it come from the fact that at the time we didn't have access as today with the internet, with everything, to see the world? Because this is quite interesting for current students, especially coming from non-Western world, how to portray this era regarding the liberal order.
Right. Well, certainly, growing up during the Cold War, it seemed, that we were living in a beleaguered world. In other words, that yes, of course, it was Western democratic, and that was better, but that it was fragile. In other words, that it was there were forces that were trying to undermine it.
You describe the current list of great powers as inchoate. Beyond military spending, what's the specific graduation criteria for a country to move from regional power to a global one? Because global power or superpower, great powers, we might have different perspective behind the term.
Well, there's I don't think there's any set benchmark I think it's one of those things where you know it when you see it. That and different countries will claim different attributes. I think there's a lot of in a lot of places there's a belief that their nation deserves to be a great power, or certainly even because it was in the past, perhaps that it deserves to be one now. Well, I think uh, I think history is pretty unforgiving. Rise can be followed by fall. It's not necessary that a country can rise again after a fall. I think it just depends on the efforts. Now, obviously, military spending is one thing, but what goes behind military spending? In other words, that you have to have a pretty strong economy to sustain that, and to have a strong economy, you have to have an educated workforce. You have to have a lot of things have to be present. And I think it's one of those things when they are present, you also have to have a leadership that's interested in acting on the global stage. In other words, you can have all the power you like, but if you don't act in different parts of the world that other countries do, then you're not acting as a great power in that part of the world. Now, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Certainly, Paul Kennedy in his Rise and Fall of the Great Powers talked about sort of the trajectory of the rise of a great power was that it stayed out of conflicts up until a certain point, and then it made a decisive entry and changed the balance. But that once it does that, then of course it's in it. You can't just withdraw, and then the burden of military expenditures allows someone else to ride out the storm in that country. If the arisen great power, is in conflict with others, then someone else has a chance to do something like this, and we have this never-ending cycle. So I think that I think the case of Europe in particular, and obviously Europe has all of the essentials to be a great power. It has a large population, certainly larger than America's, has a strong economy, educated workforce, and they do spend a lot of money on their military. But I think there is no sort of unified European action as a military power. In other words, Europe doesn't decide to deploy forces here or there, and of course they've basically since the end of the Second World War, they've basically tied their security to the United States. And part of it, I think, was simply that if the U.S. was willing and able to spend money on this, then the Europeans didn't necessarily need to, and they were happy to do that. And the Americans were happy as well up until Trump became president, and then suddenly he's not necessarily happy. And the Europeans have, I think that there is a case to be made that Europeans, certainly their actions in Ukraine, in terms of how much they've been supporting Ukraine, that Europe as a whole is acting more and more like a great power. But as we see, it's not a unified structure. There's no guarantee that Europe can act in this way. There are those who don't want it to within Europe who have if not veto power, certainly they can slow things down. And so that I think is the difference. It's for Europe in particular is how much does Europe want to act as a great power? Maybe the question will be how much does it need to if it can't rely on the United States.
We had a period of time when we were speaking about unipolarity. And I think for many people, they automatically connect this with the United States sort of competition in international geopolitics, economy, trade, everything. But from your perspective, based on your research and experience, how would you describe unipolar moment?
Well, certainly the unipolar moment seemed to arise, at the end of the Cold War. That the U.S. was the only major superpower left, and others weren't. really contesting it so much. So it appeared, and there was the idea of the end of history with the spread of democracy. It appeared that the U.S. was more powerful, but obviously there were American military interventions, but it seemed that the U.S. was also, certainly during the Clinton administration, it just wasn't as interested in involvement in other parts of the world. I think there was a sense in the U.S. that we had a lot of domestic problems that needed fixing, that the Cold War had been a distraction. So, it's what America did with this multipolar moment wasn't very impressive, it seemed, in many respects. I mean, it did a lot of things, but it could have done more. And when we saw it apparently come to the fore, of course, was with the war on terror, interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And these are fairly small countries. And these interventions, although they appeared to be initially successful, they turned out to be quagmires. And I think that there rapidly grew a sense that, if the U.S. can't even get its way in these small countries, how much of a great power is it really? And it also seemed to be with America focused on these small adversaries. This, I think, enabled much bigger ones, China and Russia, to regain strength without America focusing on them doing so. And so suddenly we found that, certainly with the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, and then the seizure of, Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014, that suddenly we did face a great power rival, and we really weren't prepared for that. In other words, we were focusing on little small rivals. And that, I think, what it showed was that the unipolar moment really had been something of a mirage. It depended on others regarding it as the unipolar as well. But of course, from the very start, there were those who sought to contest it.
Is it possible to say when the unipolar moment finished?
Well, I think that that's a matter of interpretation. I think that, I guess the first question is, well, did it ever really begin? In other words, that did America become the sole great power, or just did the Soviet Union drop out of the competition when it broke up and then only got back in later on under Putin? So that's, in other words, that's, I think, from the start. Was there ever truly a unipolar moment? I'm not sure that there really was. But let's say that there was. Then, in a certain sense, maybe one can consider the U.S. reaction to the 9/11 attacks. In other words, up until 9/11, the U.S. didn't really have to get so involved in conflict. Now, of course, there were, especially in the former Yugoslavia, but America basically was able to accomplish things. But in other parts of the world, obviously there's after the negative experience the U.S. had in Somalia, the U.S. was allergic to intervening in Africa ever since then. This is that U.S. power wasn't so interested in Africa. Now, so maybe one can consider 9/11 as the end of the unipolar moment. Certainly, then if not that, then the U.S. withdrawals certainly from Iraq, in 2010, 2011. That could be considered such a moment. Certainly, Russia's interventions seem to indicate that this moment was not present in 2008 against Georgia and 2014 against Ukraine. And then, by the time the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, and I think it was 2021, very definitely the unipolar moment was over. And then, of course, with the Russian intervention in full-scale intervention in Ukraine in 2022. Now, I think that in other words, the moment didn't. If there was a moment, a unipolar moment, it didn't end just abruptly all at once. In other words, there was a series of events that led to its weakening. That's I think what we have seen. In other words, just the general acknowledgement. I mean, that's more than anything else. In other words, it's the unipolar moment ended when people didn't see it as being present anymore.
I think that's very important to underline that many people, and especially students, they think about polarity sort of from the perspective of states, one state against the another state. But I think 9/11 is showing us that there is also the concept that you can have a different perspective on polarity, like terrorism. Terrorism as a concept, and on the other hand, a superpower. So suddenly you have a different dimension. I think this is quite good for critical thinking about how we perceive, how we understand polarity, multipolarity, or unipolarity.
Right, and I would even argue that that terrorism and sort of the war on terrorism was a mistaken way to look at the world. In other words, who were these terrorists? Whether it was Al Qaeda and then later on ISIS. That yes, they're terrorists, but not just that. That they're actually revolutionaries. That whether the Westerners like it or not, they set forth an idea that was appealing to a significant number of people. It doesn't have to be a majority anywhere, but that basically, like Marxism, Leninism, or Arab nationalism, I think that jihadism or other kinds of Islamic fundamentalisms, it was seen as a revolutionary ideology. And I think that this is why the US in particular was never able to combat it that effectively. If your enemies are simply terrorists, then basically what you have to go out and do is to kill them. Uh, but if you acknowledge that in fact they have an idea that is appealing to others, then killing them might not kill the idea. It might actually validate the idea. In other words, that killing terrorists isn't terribly useful if it merely leads to their replacement by willing volunteers. And I think that at least during the Cold War, the U.S. had an idea that we had to win a hearts and minds campaign. In other words, that we had to convince others that Marxism, Leninism, was not the best way for them to proceed. And the Marxist Leninists themselves did a lot of that for us because they always ruled incompetently. And I think that what we've seen is that when Islamists come into power as well, they don't rule in a very democratic manner, shall we say? That they often undercut themselves, and so I think that that's the thing. In other words, that these groups, Al Qaeda, ISIS, they have to be considered revolutionary movements. Now, I tried very hard to spread this idea, but it's something that certainly I found here in the U.S. that people are very resistant to. No, these are bad people. These are terrorists, and they have to be treated accordingly. To acknowledge that they have an idea that is appealing makes it that much more difficult to combat this. But it was a sensibility we had during the Cold War when it came to Marxism, and that we completely lost after 9/11.
And also, in many cases, when we read articles about killing terrorists, it means encouragement for others. Because many people believe in the following, like he was killed, so now it's my turn to follow and to prove that this ideology is still alive. And some people will not achieve that the ideology will die together with one or three people who died. So I think this is also an important aspect when we speak about your idea of how to see this movement and this concept.
Right. In order to weaken a revolutionary ideology, it has to be discredited. And usually it has to be discredited from within. In other words, I think the thing about the end of the Cold War was that the Marxist Leninists, they themselves lost confidence in the idea. In other words, that they themselves thought it was ridiculous, and also just economically suboptimal in terms of their own ambitions to be a great power. And so it was the ideology in power that slowly but surely undermined itself. And I think that, unfortunately, what that kind of means for the jihadist ideology is that it has to be in power to be fully discredited. And of course, no one wants it. We don't want it to be in power. But I think that what we've seen in Iran over and over again is these popular outbursts of opposition. People coming out into the street that and I visited Iran twice, and what struck me is that people there just had no respect for the official ideology. That it was something that was just regarded as hypocritical, as ridiculous, and what that means is that the authorities, they have to rely increasingly on force to continue their rule. But that's a slippery slope. If you can't maintain that force, then maybe you're not going to remain in power. And so I think that our Western approach, certainly the American approach to the war on terror, never acknowledged, as we did with Marxism and Leninism, the power of the idea and the need to discredit it. And so what we've seen is that in many places it has survived.
I'm glad you mentioned Soviet Union because I have one question about it, and that's the Sino-Soviet split during the Cold War. What was the impact on polarity of the world? And the second question, do you see any similar structural fault lines today that could fracture the current appearance? For instance, the West, Global South, or different poles?
Well, in my view, the Sino-Soviet split, what that meant was that the supposedly bipolar world was really a tripolar world. Um, but for the longest time, it wasn't acknowledged as such in the West. Certainly, even when I was growing up, there was we had news about the Sino-Soviet split, but we had people who saying, no, no, it's a trick. The communists are pretending to be at odds with each other in order to lull us into complacency. And they're not really at odds because, of course, they're all communists. Therefore, they must, fundamentally agree on more than they disagree on. Now, it turns out that wasn't true at all. And I think, though, that the Sino-Soviet split became increasingly salient with the image of the U.S. Losing power and influence as a result of the wars in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In other words, that with the U.S. becoming, or supposedly becoming, less of a factor in international relations, then the anti-American forces, those led by China, those led by the Soviet Union, increasingly turned on each other. So the equivalent for today is that if it is believed that American power influence really is in decline, in my view, it's very doubtful that the range of anti-Western governments, forces, whatever, are going to be able to continue their alliance. So what's the point of an alliance against America if America is weaker? In other words, that their ambitions are going to collide with one another. And we see, I think, this already with, say, an organization like the BRICS. That supposedly this is a alternative international ordering, but we see within the BRICS that there are some real serious tensions. There is between China and India to begin with. We see with between Iran and the United Arab Emirates. We see between with Egypt and Ethiopia, who are at odds over water issues. We see, and the BRICS doesn't seem to be capable of resolving any of these conflicts. That's sort of the more countries you have inside the BRICS, the more conflicts there appear to be. And the BRICS don't seem to be able to do anything about it, and that's because I don't think that they actually can. That it's not really it's not an alliance, if you will. It's like NATO, not even like the Warsaw Pact.
One of the moments that is showing the BRICS sort of real face was when there was a summit in South Africa and Putin didn't travel because he was afraid if he's going to be arrested or not, maybe not. So that situation itself, that discourse, that you have signing members of BRICS, but the leaders can't visit each other. That's practicality of the BRICS is showing something which I think those assumptions that we might have about BRICS.
Yeah, it's not a cohesive organization by any means. That there's and none of them seems to be willing or able to come to each other's defense either. That's also part of it. It's just more, a grouping of countries that want to show that they're independent of the West. But beyond that, what can they do? And it doesn't seem to be very much.
Can you also see the role of BRICS when we speak about BRICS nowadays, about the situation in Iran? Because many scholars, many experts, they're asking, so where is BRICS? Where is sort of international coherence against the Western powers?
Well, that's the problem. Where are they? They seem to be nowhere. And of course, we see that the Iranians are sending drones to target at least one other BRICS member, and that is the United Arab Emirates. There was that UAE isn't spared from drone attacks just because it's member of the BRICS. No. So yeah, it's just not that useful. It seems to me. Even for the members, maybe it feels good. Maybe they get to have their summits and they have their little moment on the stage. But especially the bigger it grows. I mean, it's sort of counterintuitive. You think the bigger that BRICS is, the more members that it has, the more powerful it is. But if anything, it seems to be weaker the more that it expands.
You distinguish between a multipolar world, a description of facts, and a multipolar world order, a system of rules. Why is that, and how to understand order when we are thinking from these perspectives?
Well, I think that a lot of people who write about the multipolar world order, that they're expressing an aspiration, that they think that somehow this will be a fairer world, a better world than either the bipolar Cold War or certainly the unipolar moment. That the idea that there are more great powers seems fairer somehow. But to me, it strikes me that countries, whether big or small, seek their advantage, and that I'm not sure why it's those who object to the unipolar world order, are they going to behave any better? In other words, than they criticize the U.S. for behaving. In other words, that they don't like being dominated by the U.S., but they want to do their fair share of dominating themselves. That's, I think, what their idea of fairness. And certainly for the smaller nations, it's not clear to me that the multipolar world is necessarily better. In other words, it may give them more opportunities for hedging between great powers, but great powers tend not to like that. They want smaller countries to make a choice usually, and they can act accordingly to constrain those choices. So it just seems to me that this hope for this vision of a fairer multipolar world order is just not based. Is just not realistic. In other words, that a multipolar world seems to be fairly conflict prone, as we're seeing now. And I'm not quite sure how this would change. And so I just don't see it as a reasonable concept.
There is a concept, global south, and some scholars like it, some don't. But my question would be about multipolarity from their perspective. Do you think that this perspective is trying to really attempt for a better world as a system and rules? Or do you think it is all nowadays just against the sort of former colonial powers, against the United States, for example, arguing with the resources, with gold, with minerals, because nowadays everything is around those resources, semiconductors, and we need some raw materials from Africa. So how would you comment on that? And I have to ask you, do you like that concept of global south, or do you think that we should name that differently?
Certainly during the Cold War, we called it the Third World. And I guess sort of the difference between the Third World and the Global South is that the Third World seemed to be an arena of competition for the superpowers. Whereas I think the idea of the Global South is that the members of the Global South are more active agents in international relations. But I think the term Global South also implies a unity of outlook that I just don't think exists. In other words, that what we have are different countries of different size, ambition, resources, and that they are also competing. I think the idea of the Global South is that they don't want to follow the leadership of the United States and perhaps not those of other countries as well. And I think here's the real, dilemma. In other words, I think China considers itself a member in good standing of the Global South, the leader of the Global South, but the Global South other countries want to be led. And so that I think is the issue. Just as the Marxist vision of a Marxist world was that it would be a more just, a better world, and even the vision of the end of history, with democracy spreading, that this would be a world free of conflict because democracies don't go to war with each other. I think that the idea of the Global South is somehow leading us into a better, fairer world is more self-delusion than anything else. That the world remains a competitive place. It's just that there are now more competitors, if you will, or at least governments acting competitively, and some of them are in the region we call the Global South, and that they're able to act elsewhere. But in terms of fundamentally altering the nature of the world, or much less bringing about a fairer world, I just don't see it happening.
You frame the ability of smaller states to play great powers against each other as they are defining future of this era. Can you please give us an example for this and comment how is that possible, and is that a significant sort of character or characteristic for the future development?
Well, I think that it is very possible. Certainly what we have seen, one example I think is the United Arab Emirates, longtime American security partner, and yet it has close cooperative relations with Russia, that a lot of Russia's trade and imports of sanctioned Western goods comes through the United Arab Emirates. And United Arab Emirates, obviously the U.S. doesn't like this, but their diplomacy in terms of, freeing prisoners held by Russia that the West wants back. In other words, that they're able to argue that our having good relations with Russia pays off for you as well. So they've managed to do it, and they're able to do it because, in fact, the UAE is important both for the U.S. and for Russia, and that neither is in a position to push the UAE to operate exclusively with one and not the other. So that's one example, and I think that there are others. Turkey as well. It has thwarted Russian ambitions, taken advantage of Russia's getting bogged down in Ukraine to gain influence compared to Russia in the South Caucasus, in Syria. They're also basically, very influential in Libya in thwarting Russia's allies there, and yet they cooperate with Russia in terms of, buying Russian gas. And Turkey is so very important, I think, to the U.S., to NATO, that although the U.S. might not like it, we basically have to live with it. So those are two examples, and I think that there are others as well. In other words, that I think there's the concept of active non-alignment. In other words, that governments they don't basically adhere to what greater powers might desire. That they decide on their own what's in their specific interests. And what's fascinating to me is that it's not a decision based necessarily on values. In other words, the whole notion of the global South, the multipolar world order somehow involving values, that it seems to the extent that we have a multipolar world is precisely because we have governments that are not pursuing values, but interests instead, interests that are not related to values, except that the value of themselves, making a profit, if you will. And to that extent, I think that's what we've seen a lot of countries doing. That the more great powers there are, the more opportunities to play them off against each other exist, at least for a while. At least, so long as the great power competition continues. That I think their complaint about the unipolar world order was that there weren't others willing to compete with the U.S. And or worse still, if the U.S. wasn't interested in helping countries, they couldn't threaten to go over to someone else to get help that the U.S. didn't want them to, because that other party just wasn't in that business either at the time. Now there are others, which to greater or lesser extent they're able to threaten. It's like, no, if you don't help us, we'll get help from them, or even if we are getting help from them, you don't want us to rely exclusively on your opponents, do you? You should do something for us as well. And I think, this can work to a certain extent, but certainly in the US, if they see a country that is cooperating too much with a country that we regard as an opponent, then we're simply not going to help them at all. It's just very difficult in sort of American domestic politics.
Many of those smaller states, they also rely on China. And there is the concept of the Belt and Road Initiative that is used in diplomacy and trade, economic development and infrastructure. And I want to ask you, US simply lost interest in many regions after 1991. So theoretically, if China achieves regional dominance, is there a risk they will also disengage from low priority areas?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that what we see is that China is obviously very concerned with its immediate neighborhood, and that they're active there and often behave threateningly. But further afield, they don't seem to be interested in military engagement, but they do seem to be interested in economic engagement. And we see them economically engaged in South Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. And to the extent that this has a political element, it appears to be basically an elite-based one, or one based on elite capture in developing countries. In other words, that they essentially make it worthwhile for leaders to make deals with China, even on some predatory terms in some cases, that basically, an individual leader might profit even if the country does not. Now, I think over time, what we've seen is that the Chinese have understood that this can be counterproductive, but they are actively and assiduously engaged in economic cooperation. Also, they're looking for this in ways that the U.S. is not. That basically, I think the U.S. government, obviously, American corporations go abroad and are interested if they can make a profit. I think Chinese corporations do too, but there's also, I think, that there's a question of, does this in fact provide advantages to the state? I think Donald Trump would like to pursue such a policy. And we've seen that he seems to be economically motivated. But the problem for Trump is that he cannot bind American corporations. As we saw with regard to his great ambitions with regard to Venezuela, the American oil companies are going to invest billions and billions. Well, it turns out that they weren't quite so interested in doing that. They've been burned before, and I think Trump was very disappointed. They're not going to follow his lead. I think in China it can be different. I think that their corporations are much more closely connected with their government.
Yeah, I watched that conference, Trump and the leaders of the oil companies, and he really, really wanted to hear that billions are coming to Venezuela, but the majority of the leaders, they were arguing with the laws and regulations and instability of the system and market constraints. And then Trump basically, he just went and looked through the window outside and returned to the table. And I think this is also discourse that we can observe as scholars, which is saying something about this vision, I think.
Right. Yeah. Trump cannot bind American corporations.
I want to ask you the same question from different perspective, and I want to use the example of Japan. Do deep alliances with Washington, like in case of Japan, actually constrain a country's great power ambitions? Or do these alliances allow them to punch above their weight in a way that a pure independent path wouldn't be allowed?
Well, I think in the case of Japan, ever since the end of World War II, they have made a decision that they're not going to act as a geopolitical great power. They basically outsourced that to the United States. And what they've done instead is that they've pursued, economic interests. Certainly their corporations have done this. And Japan also has a very active development assistance program, but that it's been very much dependent on the American security guarantee that, America can do some things for other countries, but that then Japan can step in with economic assistance and whatever. If the U.S. is not going to play this role, then I think that Japan has something of a problem. And of course, Japan has wanted the U.S. To provide for Japan's own defense, and so I think that the question that the U.S. might not be interested in doing so. The first and foremost question is, how does Japan defend itself? It's not like they're not seeing this as an opportunity. Oh, now we can get back interested in pursuing our geopolitical advantage. No, they're worried about their own defense. And remember, this is the world's oldest society. That there's just not as many young people. It's not a society that integrates outsiders easily, and so I think that they are not in a good position. That they're very nervous, and that they're hoping that the U.S. will return to the more normal role that it has been playing.
There are three countries: Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran. And you list them as the regional powers, and it's the same geography. Then we had thoughts about multipolarity. So I want to ask you, how can a multipolar system remain stable when three of its key regional poles that I mentioned view one another's existence as basically a fundamental threat?
Well, it really can't, can it? I think that's the whole problem, is that the Middle East is a region in which I would say even more than three. In other words, you have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, clearly, but Turkey, I think, also has to be considered a regional great power in the Middle East. Some would say Egypt, though it doesn't seem to really act like one. Some would even point to the United Arab Emirates, which seems to be pursuing a highly ambitious foreign policy in the region, and I guess elsewhere too. Now the problem is that without these countries are they some of them are totally against each other, and then others, they all have ambitions, and what we're seeing is that we have a lot of conflict, and that's part of the reason why we're having this conflict now between Iran on the one hand and Israel and the United States on the other. And I think that it was encouraged. I mean, there have been news reports. I don't know for sure, but that Saudi Arabia, the Emirates were very happy to see the Islamic Republic weakened. Obviously, they don't like to be targeted themselves, and they're very much counting on the U.S. to weaken Iran, and in that I think their interests are sort of more aligned with the Israelis in a certain sense, that they both agree that Iran needs to be weakened. I think one of the big problems is that, do they really want the Islamic Republic to fall? In other words, what would it be replaced by? If it's replaced by a Western-style democracy, well, that in and of itself would be a threat to the authoritarian regimes in the region. Of course, that's not going to happen. But if it's going to lead to ethnic conflict, civil war, I mean, at the very least, we'll have refugee flows that are going to impact the region. But I think that if the question of whether Iran can remain a unitary state, in other words, if you see the Kurds, the Azeris, the Baluchis, etc., possibly establishing their own independent states, well, there's possibilities for this elsewhere in the Middle East. The borders are all created by empires, whether European colonial empires or whether local empires. Persia was an empire, is an empire. And so I think that's what they're afraid of, is that if Iran unravels, that it might not stop there. That ultimately they might be able to defeat such attempts, but they don't want to face them to begin with.
There is one more question about the Middle East, and I would again like to use your research. What can we learn from the Arab Spring as evidence of an American limitation? And basically, when we put Arab Spring as a failure, and then on the other hand, we have polarity, multipolarity, what can we learn about that?
Now, the question is a good one. I mean, the U.S. didn't bring about the Arab Spring. In other words, this just happened. But when it did come about, I think that the immediate reaction was, what we saw in Eastern Europe in 1989, now we're finally seeing this same phenomenon come to the Arab world in 2011. And there was great hope that these authoritarian regimes would give way to democracy. Certainly, the sort of pro-Western liberals seem to be the leaders at first of a lot of these movements. Then, of course, it didn't work out that way. And in Tunisia and Egypt, it just seemed so quick and easy. Authoritarian rulers fell. Armed forces seemed to side with democratic forces. All was well. In Libya, obviously the regime resisted, but Gaddafi fell, and there was great hope. I remember there was great hope that Libya was now going to be a democracy, and Yemen. Syria could have been, but of course, you had the Iranians and the Russians there preventing it. But I think what we saw was that, none of these hopes panned out. For a while, it seemed that Tunisia was the one democratic success, but it turned out that wasn't either. And so the question is, well, what happened? And there are many answers. And, part of it is that the armed forces that seemed to come over to the side of the Democrats by helping get rid of the authoritarian ruler. In fact, they were just willing to get rid of the authoritarian ruler, but eventually, sooner or later, to come back themselves into power, or these countries descended into civil war, and partly because they also were divided. Syria with its many different communities, and that still is a problem there. Libya as well. I think that was this an American failure? To tell you the truth, I really think it was more an Arab failure. In other words, that they weren't able to bring about the kind of democratization that we saw in Eastern Europe. And what failed, I think, were American and Western expectations. But what we could have done to bring about a democratic outcome, it's not quite clear at all. I mean, we failed to do this forcefully in Afghanistan and Iraq. So how could we be more successful without forces present in these other countries where the Arab Spring was occurring? In other words, it would have to have been internally generated, and unfortunately, that's not what happened.
There are people who are trying to set up international norms as how the state should behave. But from your writing, I have the impression that it's more important for states, for governments, to be able to navigate through this world than to follow the norms. So I wanted to ask you about your opinion about the international norms.
Right. For better or worse, my outlook is fairly cynical. I believe that people advocate norms, governments advocate norms when it's in their interest to do so. That certainly, I think that smaller states in particular, that they are zealous advocates of international law and peaceful resolution of conflicts, which are all good things. But they also, in other words, the acceptance of these norms on the part of the great powers means that there are limits on what great powers can do or how they do them. In other words, that they pursue these norms as a for their own geopolitical ambitions, or at least to thwart the geopolitical ambitions of more powerful actors. So that's how I see what the role of norms are. I don't really think that when it comes to a question of if whenever one has to choose between a norm and one's own interests, I always think that governments tend to choose their own interests, and then of course declare that they're pursuing maybe some other norm or other. In others, I don't think that people pursue norms in contradiction of their own interests. So I'm afraid, sure that there are many people who listening to this who will be deeply offended. I don't see governments pursuing norms if doing so hurts their own interests. That they will advance norms or claim to advance norms when doing so serves their own objectives, not out of any idealistic notion.
The last question for today's interview. Based on your research and experience, what do you consider as a research line or area which we need to do more, which is under research, or maybe there is a potential for new thoughts, new approaches?
Well, the Canadian Prime Minister, who made a speech talking about the need for middle powers to cooperate in this world. And that would be a good idea. The problem, it seems to me, is that there's a lot of middle powers, and sort of, if defining a great power is not so easy, defining, I think, a middle power is even more difficult. But there are some who are Western democracies and some which are not. Does he really expect them all to cooperate with one another, sort of in to keep the great powers in check? It seems to me that the possibilities and limits of middle power cooperation is a line of inquiry that I think deserves to be pursued. I also think that the question of linkage or delinkage between conflicts in this world is an important one. Certainly, after the Russians seized Crimea and eastern Ukraine, I had occasion to visit the Middle East, and certainly in the Gulf, Arab Gulf countries. Basically, there was just no interest. They really didn't want the U.S. to be interested in in helping Ukraine. Don't worry about what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. You worry about what the Iranians are doing to us. And that's what they wanted to, in other words, and a lot of the diplomacy, I think, of the Middle East has been about, steering clear of the Russia-Ukraine conflict because they're more concerned about their own. Now, what we see is that it appears that these Iranian drone attacks in the Middle East have been assisted with Russian intelligence. In other words, that the Iranians are using methods perfected by the Russians against Ukraine for their attacks against many of the Gulf Arab states, Turkey, Israel, etc. And what we've seen is that Ukraine has now offered to help these states. And I'm just sort of wondering, is there more of a sense that, in fact, the conflicts the Middle East has with Iran and the conflicts that Russia has with Ukraine, are these now more linked? And what is the attitude of Middle Eastern states toward Ukraine? If Ukraine can be useful in their defense, to what extent are they more sympathetic toward Ukraine? Are they more willing to forego interaction with Russia if they see the Russians as not essentially not respecting them by helping the Iranians? Anyway, that's just something that I think is interesting. Is will now Middle Eastern states see the defense of Ukraine as being in their interest because of in fact that tactics developed by the Russians in Ukraine are now being used by the Iranians against them? I don't know the answer. I think it would be an interesting question to look at. Obviously, something that's just come up very, very recently, and I'm not sure what other example what can compare them with. But that, I think, would be an interesting question.
It's definitely a very interesting question because we see how many people, scholars, academics, experts, are using OSINT, which is information available online in real time, which you can share. You can use it for whatever purposes. You can help to this side or that side. You can put it online and everybody can have access free of charge, or it's open access information, which I think this conflict in Ukraine and Middle East is in some way connected by technology as well. Because we have to admit that each battlefield is a big research laboratory for those people. Bad people, good people, people who want profit, all people. So I think this is going to be a very interesting research topic. Professor Katz, many thanks for sharing your research thoughts, ideas with us. I think polarity, multipolarity, and things with the geopolitics, especially nowadays, that's fascinating research, and I hope this episode also encourages people to research more and come with good articles, perhaps books, and interesting ideas, because we live in very, very interesting times. Professor Katz, many thanks for being on IR Thinker.
And thank you so much for inviting me.